I'm continuing the reading from the book of the Egyptian myth, a guide to the ancient gods and legends. And I left off, Horus is poisoned. Isis duly shouted to the sky, causing the sun disk to halt its progress. Armed with his magic, Thoth descended from the solar boat to investigate, and on meeting Isis and finding the sick Horus, he stressed the importance of Horus safely to both himself and the other gods in Res following. Isis was not impressed. Thought, how great are your wits, but how slow are your plans, she complained, telling him that there had been mishaps after mishaps, the number of which could not be counted. See, Horus is in distress on account of poison. The evil is a deed of my brother. Death is its final destruction. And after listening carefully, Thought calmed Isis, telling her not to be afraid. He had descended from the sky with the breath of life to revive Horus. He reassured her and began to recite a lengthy spell that associated the protection of Horus with a series of divine beings, creatures, and places. His words of power destroyed the poison, driving it from the child's body. Thoth then told the villagers to return to their homes, and at Isis' request, he cast a spell to prevent them from recognizing her true identity in future. Crisis averted, Thoth returned to the sky, and the solar boat continued on its way, leaving Horus and Isis in a safe anonymity. Incidents of rape and incest during Seth's reign. Just as Horus lived in fear of Seth's violence while growing up in Chemis, his mother also faced considerable dangers. Isis suffered greatly at the hands of Seth, who robbed her of her possessions and sexually assaulted her on more than one occasion during his reign. One myth recounts how, after Seth had raped her in the 19th Lower Egyptian nome, Isis became pregnant and gave birth prematurely. The child was born half-formed as a black ibis merged with baboon. On another occasion, Seth bound Isis and again attempted to rape her, but she gripped his penis with her vaginal muscles, leaving him unable to withdraw. Leading a campaign against Seth, Isis transformed herself into the aggressive goddess Sekhmet and hid in a Gebel, high rocky outcrop. From there, she sent out flames against her enemies and burned them all to the dust. Seth, however, spotted Isis, recognizing her true identity, transformed himself into a bull to chase her down and sexually assault her. In turn, Isis changed herself into a dog, armed with a knife at the end of her tail. In this form, she managed to outrun Seth, leaving the aroused god to ejaculate onto the ground. Isis laughed at him, saying, "It is abomination to have scattered your seed, O bull. leaving Seth behind. She changed into a snake and traveled to a mountain from where she could observe the movements of Seth's allies. As they crossed from the 19th nome towards the eastern Jebel, she stung each in turn, her venom penetrating their flesh. They died immediately, and their blood spread across the mountain. The return of the king. Horus has been united with his breastband for you, that he might catch those incest following. Seize them, remove their heads, sever their frog legs, and gut them. Take their hearts and slurp their blood. Pyramid Text 535. The conclusion of the myth of Horus involves the young god reaching adulthood, at a long last confronting his uncle Seth, demanding the crown as rightful heir of Osiris. As always, there are many variations of the story, though the most detailed account today referred to the contendings of Horus and Seth is found on the New Kingdom Papyrus Chester Beatty 1. The contendings of Horus and Seth. As one might expect, when Horus came to demand his crown before the universal Lord, Re Harakenti, Seth refused to abdicate in favor of his nephew, and many of the gods supported his decision. Others, however, offered their supports to Horus, leading to a legal dispute that lasts 80 years. Even from the outset, arguments were heated. Shu, an earlier king himself, said that the office of the ruler should be awarded to Horus. The wise thoughts supported his decision, leading Isis to permanently assume her son's success. She demanded that the north wind carry the good news to the west, so that it would reach Osiris in the drought. Shu was pleased with thought, had supported him, but the universal law presiding over the court became angry at the presumptuous, as he had not yet forwarded his opinion. What is the meaning of your exercising authority alone by yourselves? The universal law shouted, and then sat in silence for a short time, furious at any. Sensing an ally, Seth intervened, asking that he and Horus be dismissed outside, assuring the god that his hands would prevail over his hands. It seems that he wanted to settle matters with a fistfight. Thought ever the diplomat asked, shouldn't we ascertain who is the impostor? Is the office of Osiris to be awarded to Seth, even while his son Horus is still about? The universal law became even more furious. He wanted to award the crown to Seth, but matters were descending into chaos. On Urias's, I don't know how to say that word, name, Onuris shouted out, "What are you going to do?" And Atum suggested that the god Benadjet be summoned to the court to help judge the case. The court agreed, and the god was sent for. Upon his arrival, along with Pat, Pata, Pat, Pata, Tat, Tenon, who seems to have hitched along for the ride. However, Banajepdet refused to make a decision and suggested that the gods write to the goddesses Neth for her opinion on the matter instead, and to do whatever she suggests. Accordingly, Thought drew up a letter and sent it, asking what they should do. Luckily, I don't know if it's Neith or Neth. I think it's Neith, Neith. Neith was more decisive than Banajepdet, saying, award the office of Osiris to his son Horus. Don't commit such blunt acts of injustice which are improper, or I shall become so furious that the sky touches the ground. And let the universal law, the bull who resides in Heliopolis, be told, enrich Seth in his possessions. Give him Aneth and Astarte, your two daughters, and install Horus in the position of his father Osiris. Neith's letter reached Thoth while he and the Enets and Need were sitting in the Horus with the projecting horns court. Thoth read aloud to his colleagues Thought read it out loud to his colleague, and together they declared Neith correct. But the universal law again grew furious and vented his anger at Horus, telling him he was despicable, inadequate for the office, and he had bad breath. Honorius became enraged, as did the Council of 30. The god Babi became so riled that he told the universal law that his shrine was vacant, a particularly hurtful comment to a god because it implied that he had no followers. The universal law, deeply offended and saddened, went to lie down for the rest of the day. The Need, also realizing that Babi had gone too far, chastised the god, telling him to get out before returning to their tents. Hathor, the universal law's daughter, came to stand before her father in his tent and unexpectedly exposed her private parts to make him laugh. Now cheerful enough to rejoin the great Enid, the universal law asked Horus and Seth to each make a case as to why they should be king. Seth went first, pointing out that he was the most virile of the gods, and that he slew Apophis, the enemy of Re. which the enemy of Re. Each night at the prow of the sun's god's boat. No other god was able to do this, he added. The gods were impressed and proclaimed Seth correct, but Thoth and Anurus reminded them that it is always wrong for an uncle to inherit the throne when the dead king's sons live. Banedetjet finally discovered his opinion, now sided with Seth, and with the universal law said something so shocking that it wasn't written down. Whatever he said, though, it affected the gods so intensely that they all became upset. It was then Horus' turn to speak. He explained how wrong it was for him to be cheated in the presence of the Aeneid and deprived of office of his father. Unfortunately, he was not given much time to speak. However, as Isis interrupted him, exclaiming that the matter should be brought before a tomb of Heliopolis and Capri in his boat. The gods agreed with her and together told her not to become angry because the rights will be given to the one who is in the right. This enraged Seth, who made an oath stating that he would take his huge sculpture and kill a god each day. An ardent Seth supporter decreed that the gods shall sail to the island in the middle, perhaps in the Nile, to continue their hearing, leaving Isis behind. He banned the ferryman, the god Nepti, from transporting any woman to the island expressly any that resembled Isis. The gods traveled to the island immediately, and upon arrival sat beneath the trees to eat bread. Meanwhile, Isis, not one to give up easily, transformed herself into an old lady with a stump, had a gold ring on her finger, and approached Nepti, the ferryman, pleading her passage to the island. She told him she was bringing a bowlful of flour for a young man who had been tending his cattle there for 5 days and was hungry. Nepti was conflicted. He knew his orders, but he saw only a harmless old lady standing before him. Isis reminded him that really it was only Isis he couldn't ferry across, and she was nowhere to be seen. She handed him a cake and returned for passage, but Nepti wasn't impressed, so she offered him a golden ring instead. His greed now satiated, Nepti relented and took her in his boat to the forbidden island. Isis arrived and found the universal law sitting eating with his fellow gods. To attract the attention of Seth, she turned herself into a beautiful woman and immediately caught his eyes. Seth followed her curiously, and Isis told him she'd been the wife of a herdsman and had borne him a son. But when her husband died, her son had been left alone to tend to the cattle. Then a stranger came and settled in their stable. He threatened to beat the son, confiscate the cattle, and evict him. Isis turned to Seth and asked him his opinion of these events, adding that she wanted him to be her companion in these matters. The god, enraptured by this beautiful woman standing before him, did not hesitate. Are the cattle to be given to the strangers even while the man's son is still about? He added that the impostor should be beaten with a rod in the face, evicted, and the son put in his position. Isis pleaded at trapping Seth, transformed into a bird and perched on the branch of an acacia tree, just out of Seth's reach. She told him to be ashamed because he had condemned himself with his own mouth, and his own cleverness had judged him. Breaking into tears, Seth ran to the universal law, who agreed that he had indeed condemned himself. In retribution for allowing Isis onto the island, Seth demanded that Nepti be punished, so that the unfortunate god was dragged into the presence of the deities on the island, and his toes were sliced off. From that day forward, Nepti hated gold. At the insistence of Atum and Re Haraketi, the gods crowned Horus king. The gods crowned Horus king, but Seth, in rage, changed him to a doll. Why are they changing my words? Let me read that again. I'm sorry. At the insistence of Atum and Re Haraketi, the gods crowned Horus king, but Seth, in rage, challenged him to a duel. To determine the rightful king, he said, they shall both change into hippopotamuses and plunge into the depth of the sea. The winner would be the god who could remain underwater for 3 months. As they sat underwater, Iris fashioned a harpoon and hurled into the sea. Her first throw struck her son. Horrified, she retracted the harpoon, and aimed again for Seth. This time it found its mark, but Seth, calling on her to remember that he was her brother, persuaded her to release him. Horus felt betrayed. He emerged from the water, his face as fierce as an upper Egyptian panther, and in a moment of rage beheaded his mother, who transformed into a headless flint statue. Taking his mother's head in his hands, Horus then disappeared up a mountainside. The universal Lord, furious at this act, decided that the gods had to punish Horus, and so they ascended to the mountains in pursuit of the young god. Seth found Horus lying in the shade of a tree, and the two began to fight. Seth, much stronger than Horus, beat the sun Osiris to the floor before ripping his eyes out and burying them in the ground. Pleased with himself, Seth left Horus blind and alone, returning to his fellow gods and telling the universal Lord that he had failed to find his youthful Nemi, Nemi, Nemes, Nemesis. While the gods continued to search for Horus, his eyes grew into lotus blossom. Eventually, Hathor came across Horus, who was crying in pain beneath his tree. To heal him, he caught the milk a jazzle, pouring the milk into the god's empty eye socket so that they healed. These acts of remorseless violence were too much for the gods of the tribunal. The universal law told Horus and Seth to sort out their problems amicably over a meal or a jug of wine so that he and the other gods could have some peace. Acquiescing, Seth invited Horus to dine at his house, where they ate and drank, eventually went for a nap on Seth's bed. During the night, Seth came aroused and placed his penis between Horus' thighs. Surprised, Horus caught Seth semen in his hands and ran to tell his mother what had happened. Isis cut off Horus' hands, throwing them into the river, and used her magic to manifest replacements. Suspecting that this was part of some larger evil design of Seth, she aroused Horus by rubbing fragrance ointments onto his phallus and caught his semen in a pot. Then, carrying the pot of semen, she sprinkled Horus' semen all over Seth's garden, so that later that night, when Seth came to eat the lettuce there, he would become impregnated with Horus' semen. Returning from the great need of the gods, Horus and Seth were again asked to present their cases. This time, Seth announced that he should be king because he had performed a man's work against Horus. The Aeneid cried out loudly and spat in Horus's face, but he laughed back at them. Everything that Seth said is a lie, he said. Summon the semen, and we'll see from where it answers. Thoth came forward and placed his hands on Horus' shoulders, saying, "Come out, you semen of Seth." The semen replied from some nearby marshes. He then placed his hands on Seth's shoulders and said, "Come out, you semen of Horus." The semen asked where it should emerge from, and Thoth suggested Seth's ears. It then rose up a golden solar disk. Seth became enraged and tried to grab the disk, but Thoth calmly took it from Seth's head and placed it upon his own as a crown. The Aeneid announced that Horus was right and Seth was wrong. Incest. Seth again challenged Horus to a duel. This time he demanded a race using stone boats, saying that whoever won the race would win the kinship. Horus duly built his ship out of cedar and plastered it to resemble a stone boat. No one noticed his deception. Seth, on the other hand, removed the top of a mountain and carved his ship from it. The Ennead lined up along the shore to watch Seth launch his ship, but as soon as it touched the water, it sank. Irritated and furious, Seth transformed into a hippopotamus and scuttled Horus' ship. In turn, Horus took his harpoon and hurled it at Seth. But the Ennead demanded he stop. Horus sailed his damaged ship to Sais to speak with Neith, complaining that it was time the judgment was finally made because the case has been dragging on for 80 years. Each day he had been proven the rightful king of Egypt. He grumbled, but Seth consistently ignored Enad's ruling. Thought then suggested at the universal Lord that a letter be written to Osiris, so that he might judge between Horus and Seth. Distressed, Horus wrote back, "Why should my son Horus be cheated when it was I who made you mighty? And it was I who created barley and emmer to sustain the gods, as well as the cattle after the gods, whereas not only God or any goddess was competent enough to do it. The universal God, the universal Lord, was not pleased with Osiris's response and wrote back to him saying that even if he had not been born, barley and emmer will still have existed. In his reply, Osiris decided to be more direct about his wishes. He raged that the universal Lord had created injustice as an accomplishment of that injustice had been allowed to sink down into Dwat. He then added not so thinly veiled threat. As for the land in which I am, it is filled with savage-faced messengers who do not fear any god or goddess. I have but to send them forth, and they will bring back the heart of whoever commits misdeeds, and they will be here with me. The contending of Horus and Seth. Thoth read Osiris's letter aloud to the Ennead, who quickly proclaimed him right, perhaps fearing of their hearts. But Seth again made a challenge to Horus, demanding that they go to the island in the middle to contend further. This they did, and Horus yet again became his uncle. Matters had come to a head, and the gods were no longer happy to watch Horus and Seth fight. Atum commanded that Seth be brought to him as a prisoner in manacles, and asked him why he had kept himself from being judged and why he wanted to usurp the office of Horus. Seth at long last relented and told him to bring Horus, and awarded him the throne of Osiris. Accordingly, Horus was brought and crowned, and Isis shouted in joy. Ptah then asked what should be done with Seth, and Reharketi, the universal Lord, responded that he would take him to dwell with him as a son. He would thunder in the sky and be feared. The entire land and the Ennead rejoiced now that matters had finally been settled.